Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi. Today's special guest is John Bolton, former U.S. National Security Advisor under President Trump and former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations under President George W. Bush. Known as a hawk in the U.S. foreign policy circle, Ambassador Bolton has been a staunch supporter for Taiwan's democracy and security for decades. With the changing world order and new challenges facing U.S. global leadership, as well as its own domestic politics, let's hear Ambassador Bolton's view of today's world. Welcome, Ambassador Bolton.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
You vowed to launch a presidential bid to stop Donald Trump based on having a stronger U.S. foreign policy. How serious are you, and when can we expect that announcement?
Well, right now I'm considering whether to run. It's obviously a very serious decision. I did look at running for the Republican nomination in 2016. Took a good amount of time in doing the due diligence that you need to do to make the best decision. Ultimately, I decided not to run because there were so many other candidates in the race. Now, this time I had not really thought of trying again, but when the former president said the U.S. Constitution should be terminated, I was moved to reconsider. And I was also bothered by really the lack of a clear rejection of that idea by some of the other people mentioned as possible candidates. So if I did get in the race, it would not be as a one-issue candidate or simply to oppose Donald Trump. It would be with the full intention of trying to win the nomination. That's obviously a strenuous task and a lot required. So I'm in the deliberation stage right now, and I think I've got some time to consider, and I've been talking to people all over the country, and we'll see what happens next.
Well, you've served in every Republican administration since President Reagan, and obviously the last being in the Trump administration. How has the world changed in your view over the last 3 to 4 decades? And have you changed your view on how America should lead and respond to global threats?
Well, certainly the most significant change was the collapse of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, the breakup of the Soviet Union itself, which was conventionally, I think, and properly seen as the end of the Cold War. The focus was on Russia, obviously not the People's Republic of China, but from that perspective, it was really America's victory in the Third World War of the 20th century and a momentous achievement for everyone who stood against the Soviet threat. Many people, I think, overreacted to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They called it the end of history. They said that we now had a peace dividend. We didn't need to spend so much on military affairs. We could spend it on domestic programs. And I think the West as a whole, I mean the global West in the sense we use that term, made a big mistake. And it was not the end of history. We can see that with 2020 hindsight today. We should have understood it at the time. Many problems still remain, including with Russia itself, which we can see today in the war in Ukraine. But I think the idea that globalization had taken over, that political risk around the world had disappeared, that the threat of aggressive, hostile nations was now no longer something that we had to face. In the U.S. election of 1992, Bill Clinton won saying it's the economy, stupid, whereas in previous years it had been national security. I think we had a partial wake-up call in the United States on 9/11 when we were attacked by radical Islamic terrorists. But even that, over time, the memory has faded. But I think today we can see that substantial new threats have emerged. Russia itself remains a threat. The threat of nuclear proliferation from the likes of North Korea and Iran remains very dangerous. Radical terrorism has not disappeared from the world. But obviously, the most significant difference between, let's say, the beginning of the Reagan administration in 1981 and today, 4 decades, is the rise of mainland China. And they did something in the mid-1980s when Deng Xiaoping abandoned many Marxist economic principles and moved to free market principles, at least in part. China's economy did very, very well, and that economic growth gave it the capacity to increase its military forces, to begin, in today's terms, building up a substantial nuclear arsenal. It's got a very sophisticated cyber warfare program. It has anti-satellite programs. It's building a blue water navy for the first time in 600 years in Chinese history. And it poses a direct threat to many countries along its Indo-Pacific periphery. I think from the U.S. point of view, Beijing is the existential threat of the 21st century. And so this is a complete flip from Reagan's Cold War days, when the Soviet Union was the biggest threat, to today when China is.
And why do you think that China has surprised you, probably, and many in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, in terms of what they have become and how they have been able to challenge the United States economically, politically, and militarily? Was it because the U.S. was solely focused on other regions, the Soviet and then the Middle East, and got distracted, or was there any other reason?
Well, I think the move by China toward what we thought would be a market-oriented system for its economy roughly coincided with the collapse of the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe and then the Soviet Union itself. Deng Xiaoping was saying things like, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, meaning he wasn't going to insist on Marxist principles. And there was, in the 1990s, I think, U.S. policy, as articulated by authorities like Henry Kissinger and others, looked at China based on two foundational principles. Number one, that China's economic rise would make it a more responsible power internationally. It would play by the global rules. Ultimately, it would join the World Trade Organization. Its market principles would spread, and it would behave like other industrializing democracies in the West or in Asia. And number two, that the growth of prosperity on the mainland would also lead to greater democracy, and it would spread, and that would also make China act more typically international. Both of those proved to be wrong.
Yeah, and I think those assumptions were based on the experience with the Soviet Union, probably, and probably also due to, in some way, the ignorance about China in Washington, D.C. That's why we're seeing that, I think China has been studying the U.S. political system, society, and economic system for decades since its opening. But the U.S. seems to understand China very little. And so it goes without saying that, way more Chinese understand America than the other way around. So do you think that's a problem? Meaning, are the threats that are perceived in Washington, D.C. today from China exaggerated? And does Washington, D.C. need more nuanced views and understanding of China in order to truly compete with that rising power?
Well, I think actually the U.S. has understood China pretty well over the years. We've had a long involvement in it, and from our opening days, the first American trading vessel sailed for China in early 1784. It was called the Empress of China, launched in 1783, the same year as the Treaty of Versailles confirmed our independence. And I think in the days of the open door policy, the U.S. did have a pretty benign view of China. We aided Chiang Kai-shek during the Civil War in an effort to keep the Japanese and the Chinese communists from coming into power. I think what we misunderstood about China in recent days were the things I mentioned, that it would behave more responsibly internationally, that it would become more democratic. I think we also underestimated the continuing grip of the communist ideology. I think in the 1990s, many people thought that, as in Russia, communism as a governing philosophy was going to disappear. China might still be authoritarian in many respects. The Communist Party was still in control, but it was an authoritarian party, not a communist party. I think we see now with Xi Jinping, who has elevated his thought to be equivalent to Marx and Lenin and Mao Zedong, that it's still very much a communist approach. So we are learning a lot, particularly about China's aggressive intent, which is much more than political and military, it's economic as well. And I do think this, we're coming from behind in many respects. We were too naive about China, but we have a lot of friends in the region who are helping to explain what's going on. And I think in any race like this, I would never bet against the United States.
So you obviously have been involved in all the foreign policy key decision making for a long time, and you are also one of the very first, I would say, senior former government officials who said Taiwan should be an independent country as far back in February 2000, against at that time the mainstream view. Now you also advocate for a U.S. military presence in Taiwan. Can you elaborate on these views?
Well, I think it's always useful to build your foreign policy on reality. And the reality of Taiwan for 2 decades now, really, since the time of Lee Teng-hui, if not before, was it's a functioning democracy acting in a full control over the sovereignty it exercises over Taiwan and the other islands. It behaves in a responsible fashion. It's a major economic player in the world, despite its relatively small size. It's extremely important to the United States. And in terms of any customary international law definition of a state and having the legitimacy of its people electing its government, it meets every test anybody could imagine. People have been intimidated by Beijing on this point. I think it's time to tell Beijing we'll have diplomatic relations with whom we want to have diplomatic relations with. And that includes Beijing for sure, but you're not going to tell us how to behave. Now, I think that...
Does that mean you think the U.S. should have a diplomatic relationship with Taiwan?
Yes, I think there should be full diplomatic relations. And if Beijing doesn't like it, they can take whatever steps they want. But the idea that somehow we have to condition our foreign policy to suit Beijing's domestic political view of its relationship with Taiwan, to me, is unacceptable. Now,
and are you then worried about a potential conflict should Washington, D.C. recognize Taipei?
I don't think there's any chance of a conflict. I think Beijing is bluffing on that score. I think they've made a lot out of diplomatic niceties. And I think, again, foreign policy should be based on reality. Taiwan is an independent country. Its people see themselves as independent, and I think we should treat them that way. Now, Beijing undoubtedly has aggressive designs against Taiwan. They say it repeatedly. They've demonstrated it through the recent blockade that they threw around the island when Nancy Pelosi visited. Mm-hmm. And I think it's in America's interest and in the interest of other Indo-Pacific countries to make it clear what we have said repeatedly since 1949, that military aggression to reunite China is unacceptable. And that we're going to act in support of the commitments, the obligations that we, the United States, have. I think there are a lot of components to that. I think supplying more effective weapon systems to Taiwan, training and assisting Taiwan's military, encouraging Taiwan to make it very clear to the U.S. and Europe in particular that it is prepared, like the Ukraine, to fight for its independence. Hopefully it won't come to that, but I think that needs to be made clear. Now, part of deterring Beijing from invading or trying to blockade Taiwan is to show American commitment. So I think we should abandon the idea of strategic ambiguity. I think it served its purpose in its time, but I think now it may encourage Chinese aggression more than deter it. And I hope that by having more American forces on Taiwan to train and assist, not dissimilar to the way it was before derecognition by the Carter administration in 1979, perhaps by home porting some American naval vessels in Kaohsiung, and to have other Asian, Indo-Pacific countries also stand behind Taiwan would go a long way, both militarily and maybe over the long term, even more importantly, politically, in convincing China it has far more to lose in being aggressive toward Taiwan than it could possibly gain.
I think what you just said is probably still too risky to a lot of people in Washington, D.C. And, you're known as a U.S. foreign policy hawk, and perhaps so hawkish that even some Republican senators do not feel comfortable with your view when it comes to, wars and conflicts. So, a question for you is, regardless of how people characterize you, how would you describe John Bolton's worldview?
Well, I don't like the bumper sticker approach to calling somebody an interventionist or an isolationist. I don't think it helps. If I had to be pinned down to a bumper sticker, I'd say my foreign policy is pro-American. And the ideal conduct of foreign policy is not to engage in military conflict, but to prevent it, to achieve your national interest without resorting to military means. And I think that is very much what Ronald Reagan did and led to our victory in the Cold War over the Soviet Union through what Reagan called peace through strength, to have the deterrent capability that would mean no other nation challenged us. And I think that's really what we need to return to in the United States. Former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld always used to say, American strength is not provocative. American weakness is what's provocative. So, in terms of what conditions are in Washington today, if we had this conversation a couple of weeks ago, there might have been more support for an isolationist position. We've been seeing now at least one Chinese espionage balloon over the United States shot down. I think it should have been shot down before it reached Alaska, not after it transited the country. Over the weekend, we've had 3 other objects shot down, 2 over the United States, 1 over Canada. Government hasn't said exactly what they were. But this is an indication that it's Chinese aggressiveness here that's causing the increase in tensions. It's not America's design to have greater conflict, but it's China that's building military bases in the South China Sea on islands whose control is contested by the Philippines, by Vietnam, by Taiwan, in fact, by others. It's China that threatens Taiwan. It's China that threatens the Japanese in the Senkaku Islands. It's China that's building military bases and conducting hostile acts along its line of control with India. It's China that last had a war with Vietnam in the late 1970s. So if you look around China's periphery, I think we can see where the source of the conflict is.
But I think what you said, obviously, were all true in terms of those threats. But I think people also notice one of the major shifts in U.S. foreign policy in recent years is how it's increasingly an extension of the U.S. domestic politics. What started, especially in the Trump administration, was a narrative that kind of capture domestic grudges against globalization and coastal elites. It feels like America is turning inward to defend itself. And this has continued in the Biden administration. Now, Biden's State of the Union speech was almost like another version of Trump's America First, without the anger and darkness. So many people kind of worry that, okay, American public sentiment, can probably be easily manipulated with today's media and social media to have another event like January 6th, further eroding the U.S. institutions and the existing political system. Are you worried about that?
No, I'm not worried about another January the 6th. Look, Donald Trump was an aberration in American history. He's fading rapidly. He's not going to get the Republican nomination in 2024. If he did, he would be defeated, much to the detriment of the Republican Party, I might add. The Democratic Party has long not been strong enough on national security. In my view, it's not the party of Harry Truman and Dean Acheson anymore. But the Republican Party remains the party of national security. There are some isolationists within the party. I think they remain a very small number. They have been influenced by Donald Trump, particularly with respect to Ukraine. But Trump doesn't really have a foreign policy it can copy. He had incoherent views on China. He wanted the world's greatest trade deal with China. At the same time, he complained about other aspects of Chinese behavior. But under Trump, we took the first strong sanctions against Huawei and ZTE. And under Biden, those sanctions have grown even stronger. So I don't think this balloon incident that we've been going through is going to make life any easier for China. I think they badly miscalculated here.
Yeah, the fact that, I have to ask this question because it's on many people's minds. The fact that Trump was even elected and caused so much damage to the government and U.S. standing in the world. Is this a problem of democracy? Would you say, perhaps it's time to think about whether there's a better alternative?
No, I think, as I say, I think Trump is an aberration. And I think the American constitutional system survived him. He caused damage to the country and the party, but I think that damage is repairable. The reason I opposed him getting a second term was that I did worry in a second term he might cause damage that was not repairable. But to look at 2016, ultimately in the race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, the polls showed that both of them were disliked by large numbers of the American population. It turned out more of them disliked Hillary Clinton than they disliked Donald Trump. That's how he won election. But he was defeated in 2020. And he, as I say, I think he's slipping among Republicans day by day. I don't think he's going to get the 2024 nomination. It's a warning sign that every once in a while a country can get this aberration as head of one of the major parties. But I don't think it represents anything like a continuing trend.
I've been meaning to ask this question. In hindsight, would you have rather Hillary Clinton won 2016 presidential election?
Oh my goodness, no. She and her husband, Bill Clinton, were a year ahead of me in law school. So I like to say I've been burdened with them a lot longer than most of the American public. The fact is, in 2016, I supported Trump. I felt it was a much better alternative. I worked in the administration for 17 months. I did the best I could. In the 2020 election, I didn't vote for Trump or Biden. I didn't think either one of them should be president. So I wrote in the name of a real conservative Republican and have been spending a fair amount of time since the 2020 election and will continue to do so to make sure that a true conservative gets the Republican Party's nomination. A Reaganite foreign policy, I think, is what the party supports. I think that's what its members across the country support. And I think it's the right policy for the United States.
Well, Taiwan is another vibrant democracy that often looks up to the U.S., is now asking a very similar question in terms of whether democracy is truly the best political system. What do you think should be Taiwan's strategy forward, not just in terms of its own survival internationally, but also how it should deal with China, its own domestic politics, and of course, ultimately, how should it work with the U.S.?
Well, I think the only legitimate kind of government wherever you live around the world is a government that represents its people, what Abraham Lincoln called government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That's what our fundamental view is. And I think you can see in the aspirations of people all around the world, that's what they wanted. The form will differ somewhat, but it's ruled by the people that gives legitimacy to the government. And Taiwan has emerged as a real democracy. I mean, I don't speak Chinese, so I can't read the local newspapers, but I talk to many people from Taiwan, and it has a free press and uninhibited political debate. It's really an example for the rest of the world. So there's no need even to consider turning away. But I think Taiwan should now try to take advantage of the menace that China is posing and that is more and more visible around the world. In Europe, many countries watching the Russian invasion of Ukraine have begun to increase their relations with Taiwan, the Baltic republics, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, small countries facing a very large country that has threatened them in the past. So this is a moment, I think, that Taiwan can begin to escape the diplomatic isolation that Beijing has tried to enforce in the past several decades. And I do sense around the Indo-Pacific more appreciation that the the problems each individual country has have to be looked at in terms of a larger collective defense, collective security concept. You know, we have the Asian Quad now that that Shinzo Abe, the former prime minister of Japan, pushed very hard with Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. We've seen the AUKUS agreement on nuclear submarines for Australia with the UK and the US. There are many, many possibilities here. I think Taiwan's ultimate security and its larger diplomatic objective should be to make every effort to fit itself into these larger collective alliances if they come to that. You know, across the North Atlantic, we have NATO. There's never really been anything like that in the Indo-Pacific. America's had very strong bilateral alliances, but honestly, it's been hard for many of our partners to work together because of history and many, many other factors. Faced with the Chinese challenge, I think this is a good time for Taiwan to help become part of that emerging defense structure.
Well, it sounds like you're not too opposed to many of the Biden administration's foreign policy, just as you cited some of the initiatives. However, you know, 2024 is fast approaching. Whether you're going to be the presidential candidate or you're advising one of the Republicans' presidential candidates, how would you have run the foreign policy differently? Or perhaps what would be your ideal foreign policy for the United States that's pro-America?
Well, I don't think it's a policy where we retreat from the world. We have interest around the world. We have friends, economic partners, political allies around the world. And I think in the face of aggression, which we've seen in its purest military form with Russia's attack on Ukraine just about a year ago, history has not ended. And countries that are willing to use force illegitimately to gain their objectives, whether for ideological reasons, political reasons, whatever it might be, still exist. The United States really is the only country that has worldwide interest. It's not just across the Atlantic. It's not just across the Pacific. It's not just in the Western Hemisphere. It's worldwide. So we undertake this leadership not as an act of charity to the rest of the world, but because it's in our interest to do it. That's what the people have to believe. We benefit many other people, but we benefit ourselves too. I think Americans are adults. I think through their history, they've understood this. They're looking for a leader who can explain it once again.
Well, with that, thank you, Ambassador Bolton, so much for speaking to our audience today. I think your depth and breadth of, and knowledge of foreign policy is truly unparalleled. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to have you back on the show very soon. Take care. All right.